Hello everybody and welcome back to the next part of this series. In the last part we set up our components, we inherited it from each other and overridden some functions that modify the values inside of those components. And before we continue with that, I want to show you a little overview of what we have so far. We just drag that in. So this is how we went. We started with the actor component that is pre-existing. From that we created our value component, and from the value component we inherited to create the leveled value component, the stats component, the attributes component, and the regenerative component. And you may remember our little Excel sheet that we kind of made to have a course overview of those things. When we look at that, we will see that actually the attributes component is shared by most of our components except for two, while for the stats there are three that don't have them. And if we split up components further, for example the metabolism, if we would split that up for a food and a thirst component individually, it would make a lot of more sense if we had actually gone from the leveled value component to the attribute component and derived the stats component from the attribute component and then the regenerative component from that. So let's say that is the situation. We started with our project, we made some initial assumptions, we started vividly coding together our components, and now we discover we should have made it a little bit different. We should have set up our chain of inheritance a little bit different. Now, do we have to delete all these components or all the components except the leveled value and the value component and start all over again implementing that? No, we can actually change the chain of inheritance. So what we want to do basically is taking our attributes component and our stats component and just have them trade places. So that means we have to modify something in the attributes component that will tell it's, hey, your parent is no longer the stats component, but your parent is the leveled value component. And to tell then the stats component, no, you are not longer inheriting from the leveled value component, but you will inherit from the attribute component instead. Finally, we have to tell the regenerative component that it now does not inherit any longer from the stats component, but from the it does inherit from the stats component and no longer from the attributes component. So because this can be a bit confusing at times, we go through this step by step, and it works like this. When you open up your blueprint, let's start with the very first one. You have on the top a tab that's called class settings, and in the class settings we have this parent class property, which is set to actor components. That's where we start our chain of inheritance. And if we open then up the level component, we see that it inherits from our value component and so forth. And when we now change the values for these entries for the attributes component, for example, which is currently inheriting from the stats component, and we change that to our leveled value component, then we get a little message here that says reparenting this blueprint may cause data loss. Continue. We choose to continue, getting back to this potential data loss a little bit later. We compile, we save. So that was the change we done to our attributes component. Now we open our stats component, do the same thing. Nope, you're no longer inheriting from the leveled value component. You inherit from the attribute component instead. Save and compile. And notice we don't get an error message here. And then finally we go to our regenerative component. Nope, you're not longer coming from the attribute component. You will be coming from the stats component. Again, we get no error. If we had further components deriving from the regenerative component and other components then deriving from that, we wouldn't have to change anything, because they then still go up until regen component, and that as a base does not change then in this case. So this would be our new setup: actor component, value component, leveled value component, then our attributes, then our stats, and then our regenerative components. So we save everything out, make sure everything is safe. And now let's talk a little bit about the risks and caveats of reparenting classes. Let's take for our example our stats component. That's one we changed. And here in our update value function, it's open, we see that it calls the parent update value that's coming from value component. And in this case we got away with it because our parent either the attribute or the stats component, they were both inheriting from leveled value component as well as from value component, which implements this function. So we can see if we hover over it, target is the value component. If we click onto it, we are taken to the value component and are in that function. Now imagine I would reparent this class to an entirely different structure, to a class that has no value variable, that has no update value function, and so on. Now I'm telling here that this would then be the new base class. But what is that update function then supposed to do? There is no parent function implemented that it could call. Everything would no longer really work. At least not the way we want it to work. So always keep that in mind when you are reparenting, that the class that you reparent, when it accesses parent functions, that all of those parent functions exist somewhere in the inheritance line of your new base class that you choose for that particular class. So that's an important thing. Another thing concerning data loss is that I haven't experienced this myself, but it is said that when you do this kind of reparenting, that default values that you choose for your variables, for example here the 100, that they somehow are reset and return to 0 or just empty values. As I said, I haven't experienced this myself, but I've seen forum posts and even a survey where this was widely discussed. So if you encounter it, you may have a reproduction case, and then this can be fixed. But let's save and close that again. So that was the basic setup for our initial components, and up to this point we have implemented a lot of blueprint nodes, a lot of functions, but we haven't actually checked if anything of that what we do here with our widget references and our values and our calculations and update stuff, if all that works. So we are now gonna create our actual components that go into the character based on these components here. So we go on our components folder, create a new one, and we call it player, because those are the components then for our player. we go to blueprints, create a new blueprint class, and we expand the all classes section, and we choose as a base class, we start with the health component. So let's choose a region comp for that. Select it and we call it health comp. Now we can implement here everything that is specific to our health components and differs from things that other components don't do that way. So first we save that. Here in our class settings we see we have the regen comp as a base class, and again, as long as we stay inside our line of inheritance of our classes, we could even switch them out. So we check our overridable functions. They are all here, they are all there, and we're not gonna implement anything at this point. So, we're just creating all our components first, and then we set them up in the character so we can actually manipulate them from there. So we have our health component. We just duplicate it because the stamina component will also stem from that. We duplicate it again and call it the thirst component. We duplicate it again and call it the hunger component. Oops. Should be consistent here with my abbreviations. So now the XP component. At the moment I'm inheriting them all from the regen component. We can later change this out for components that have more than they need. But again, we can safely do it in this case because we are in this very linear line of inheritance. For more complicated structures, then you should really avoid reparenting and spend more time on setting this up correctly in the first place. I just have done this here to show you how reparenting works, and I've done it this early in the project. So our structure that we have is not very complicated or complex, and but don't take this as a license that you can just code away and change later things anytime. You can change things, most things anytime, but that comes at a cost, and the more complex it gets, the more likely is that you will break your project in the process. So having said that, we can continue with our next component. The next component would be our carry component. We duplicate that. For example, the carry component will definitely not be a regenerative component. But yeah, as I said, we change that later. We duplicate this again, and it's the temp component. And now some of the components that we don't see in our stats bar here. So we don't have to reparent everything at the end. We can take this from the attributes component directly. We create a child class and we call it the accuracy component. Let's put that in our player folder. Save them out. So our accuracy component, now we duplicate that and call it the strength component, and all the other ones that we have, like dexterity component, and duplicate it once again for the resilience component. And in case we missed any, we can add them later anytime. We save everything. Now we have a whole lot of components for our character, and when they go into our character, everything is nicely compartmentalized and not creating one big messy character script graph. So we go to our character, this one, open up our character blueprint, and now we basically just add them to our character. Pull this down a little bit. So we start with our health, with then the stamina, then the thirst, and the hunger, then the XP, then the carry, then the temperature. Those are all the things that are in our bar at the top. And then our other components: strength, accuracy, dexterity, where are you? Here. And resilience. Oh, and of course we have our metabolism component. So thirst and hunger are separate, and duplicate that once again. Call this metabolism comp, and add it also to our character. Like this. It's a real shame that we cannot change categories or create categories for those. Neither we can sort them around. So yeah, at the moment, because we created them all first, we could set them up the way we want, but we can now could no longer insert anything here or keep it a little bit more grouped or organized. But we just have to live with that for the moment. Let's see what we else could do while we're already here in our character. Yeah, we could set up now our function that we created in the second episode of this series. You may remember when we set up our begin play. We created two functions, the build UI and the setup components. In the build UI, we created all our UI widgets elements and set them up. So now we're going to our event graph again and select our setup components function. And now that we have our components, that we have all our widget references that we need, we can set them up and tell each component what its widget is. So again, we pull out a sequence node, and we start with our health component. Our health component has an attribute bar widget and can have a stats bar widget. We take care of the stats bar widget first. So we say set stats bar widget, which sets the reference to that widget. And we take that from our stats bar widget reference that we set up in our build UI function and get the health bar. And our health bar is of type radial bar widget. And the way we set up our variable type for our component. It expects a radial bar widget, so that comes in there nicely. Connect that up, compile and save. And now when we play, our health bar goes to 0 as opposed to the other ones. And when we come back from begin play, we see that we have a lot of errors here. Apparently our update display triggered by the update value function in a stats comp didn't work. Now let's see why this is. Why did this not work? Our update stats widget is perfectly okay here. The stats bar widget should be set. For health component we did it here, for the other ones we didn't. But since we're not updating values, apparently that should not make any difference. So when we look at the code that's here in these functions, here the parent function is also there. We don't see anything that would indicate us to what's going on. What is going on here is we execute not only the code that are in our class, but also the ancestor code is executed. And since this component, our health component and all the others, as they stem from the regen component, they do what the regen component does, and that is, if we take a look at it again, that is doing something on tick. It does the regenerating, and this calls the update value, which in turn modifies the value here in the value comp parent class, and then it updates the display. And if there is no display attached to it, as we don't have done it for most of our components, then those components will always try to update their widget, and they have no reference to it yet. That's why we're getting spammed with these access to none errors. So the solution is, or the root problem is, that components tick by default. So we open up our very first one. We set the start with tick enabled to false. We compile that. We save everything. Now it wants to save a whole bunch of that, because that tick property, it propagates through all the children, so we don't have to set it for every component. And now when we hit play, we see that our health bar value is not changed to 0 because it's not getting updated anymore. And if we come out of begin play now, we don't see any errors anymore, and that has been solved. So always when you see an error or something is throwing an error, here it was for the stats component, because that is the one initiating that update, because neither the attribute component or other regenerative components that come after it override this function value, this function code. So this one is named as the culprit in the log, but it may not necessarily be the class that is causing the problem. So always check your ancestor classes if they are doing something that's then causing the issue. Not always focus on your immediate class that you have here. So now let's finish up our component reference setup. We go to our third person character blueprint again. And for the other components, this works pretty similar again. Although I make one change. First, I called all these widget variables widget, but that's not something I usually do. So let's go into our attribute component that has our attribute bar widget reference. I call everything a reference that gets referenced outside, so it's not something that the class itself would maintain or populate with a value or a reference value, and all the other stuff that don't get the reference suffix. So I changed that for those types, and we see the regenerative component inherits those values. Now we can go back to our third person, and we have our references. So we take the next one, the stamina component, and so on. I'm speeding this up again so you can see the finished product a little bit sooner. So what we have now here is our finished setup. Every stats bar widget reference is set for each component. We pull them out of our stats bar widget reference, and we compile that, and we play. Still no errors. If we had done this for all the components and then and also for the other components that show up on the attributes bar, we also would have gotten no error, since every component would have then had their proper reference. But that wasn't the case, so we ended up with all these errors. So we have done that for the stats bar components, for our stats bar widgets. Now we take the other components and set them up similarly. I also gonna speed this up then, and we look on the result again. So what I've done now is setting that up for the attributes bar, and the attributes, since they are not readily on the surface just as our stats bar, they are deep down in our UI panel widget, in the body panel, on the attributes page, in the attributes panel widget. I'm gonna change that name in a second. And there we have the attributes array. And I just saved that out to a local variable, so we don't have to retrieve this rat's tail of reference around. So here we have our local attributes array, and it sets all the attribute bar references. We also have to add that for the components that have both. So I just leave it now as this. I may even split that up into two different sub-functions, or at least make two separate sequence branches out of it. It looks a bit ugly, but for the moment we leave it like that. So we compile, we hit save, and close that out. And now all of our components have either reference to their widget up there on the top of the screen, or to their various attributes bar that we dug up from here. So now let's make our display bars display something else than the default values that we set up in our parameters. So we go into our main graph of our character blueprint. Let's move that a little bit out of the way. We're gonna also tend to this function in the next episode again to make that a little bit better and more versatile. Right now we add a third pin here and add another function. We call it initialize components. Again, we hook it up to our event graph, and on begin play our execution order is like this. We build our UI, so we have all the widgets, we make all the components acquaint to their widgets, tell them where they are, and we initialize the components and give them some of their basic initial values. This is only done temporarily here as well. We could later then think about putting them in different classes, so we could have different start settings to begin with that would or could translate to different difficulty levels in the game. But for now we're just initializing them to the same values, and we do that here in our begin play. So in our initialize components we pull out another sequence node and we start with our health component. Let's do that. And we call the update value function. Hook that up and give it a level of a score of say 30. This should give us 30% on our bar, since the high bound is by default set to 100. So we hit play. And of course it's not 30, it's 0.3. Here we have it, slightly over a quarter, it's at 0.3. Now why is this at 0.3? I leave that a little bit as a cliffhanger this time, as we won't do much further in this episode. We're gonna finish that up the next time, and then we can also expand on our other functions a little bit. I leave that one, as I said, as a cliffhanger. Try to think, if you were following along, why we have now this problem here. I give you a clue. Somewhere along the way we are using a value where we should use a function result. If you have been following along, you might have spotted it already. And the next time I show you how you would dig up an error like this and find out what is going on there. Until then, have fun with the engine. Bye.